Good afternoon, and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of The Appeal and Now This. I'm Jay Willis. Earlier this week, when Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx watched a mob of Trump supporters, white nationalists, and right-wing conspiracy theorists lay siege to the United States Capitol building, the scene felt a little familiar to her. In April 2019, a coalition of hate groups put on a similar demonstration outside of Foxx's office in Chicago, in a protest that was organized by the city's largest police union. Now, attendees at that protest said that they were protesting her office's decision to drop criminal charges against Jussie Smollett, the actor who falsely claimed to have been attacked by Trump supporters. But Foxx was struck by the fact that the event 2 years before had also united hate groups with law enforcement voices, a trend that she now sees continuing with the insurrection on Capitol Hill this week. So for more on the connection between these two events and the disturbing alliances between hate groups and people vested with the authority to carry out state-sanctioned violence, we are joined by State's Attorney Foxx and my colleague, the Appeal's Jerry Iannelli. Thank you both for joining us. And State's Attorney Foxx, I'll start with you. Can you just give our viewers a little more context about the connection between the protests outside your office 2 years ago and what we saw in DC on Wednesday?
Certainly. Thank you for having me, Jay. It was very eerily familiar. Back in April of 2019, as you said, there was a rally organized by the Fraternal Order of Police Chicago chapter that was headed by the now president of that chapter, wearing a Trump jersey emblazoned on his chest. There were members of a group that I had never heard of at the time called QAnon, and 4 separate white nationalist groups, including the Proud Boys, were proudly out there marching with the same Trump signs, the same Blue Lives Matter flags, things that I saw just 2 days ago. And I found it incredibly troubling then in 2019 that the Fraternal Order of Police Chicago chapter somehow found comfort in the company of white nationalist groups. And so, it has not been widely reported. It was something that I thought, again, deserved more attention, that when I saw it on Wednesday, that these same groups carrying same flags under the same banners were taking over the Capitol building. It was not a surprise to me at all.
I want to ask too about the police response to these protests, riots, etc. Do you see a connection between tell me a little bit about how police responded first to the protest outside your office, and then compare that to how police responded to the violent insurrection that mobbed the Capitol?
Listen, it was an organized event outside my office by members of law enforcement. And there were counter protesters from the Black Lives Matter movement and others who came who were quite frankly appalled by some of the behavior. What was particularly appalling, we had members of law enforcement, some who were retired, who were making comments that would shock any of our sensibilities. There was one retired police officer caught on video claiming that Laquan McDonald, a 17-year-old who was murdered by a Chicago police officer, shot 16 times, should have been shot 17 times, should have been shot 18 times. And again, for an organization of law enforcement to have one of their own so brazenly and unapologetically spew those views at the prosecutor told me that we had a real insidious problem. And then when you look at what happened on Wednesday, there's not a person with any sensibilities who could tell you that the response to law enforcement and to what happened as a result of those rioters is in any way how those who were treated in the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer or any other event, whether it was Mike Brown in Ferguson or Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge, it was completely different. And I think the concern that we ought to have is what is the role of law enforcement, not just in their response, but actually in their engagement in the behavior that we saw.
So in an interview yesterday, the head of the Chicago Police Union defended the mob that stormed the Capitol, repeating debunked conspiracy theories about voter fraud swinging the presidential election results. And I'll read part of his quote: "They're individuals, they get to do what they want. Again, they were voicing frustration. They're entitled to voice their frustration. They clearly have been ignored, and they're still being ignored as if they're lunatics and treasonous now, which is beyond stupid, end quote. State's Attorney Foxx, is this beyond stupid? How does this kind of rhetoric impact local trust in law enforcement, in the people who are ostensibly supposed to be serving and protecting them?
It destroys. It destroys it. Every effort that we make to rebuild community trust, which has been fractured not by the community, but by law enforcement, with rhetoric like this, sends us back, sets us all the way back. Just this past summer, when my office had a policy of not prosecuting protesters who were engaged in peaceful, nonviolent protests, this is the same police union chief who said that people were behaving like savages. This is the same police union chief who said that there were no consequences for their actions. And yet when they go and desecrate, our nation's capital, there are now 5 people who are dead as a result, 5, including a fellow law enforcement member. His remarks are repugnant. And you have to ask yourself, if you would say these things in this context, what are you saying on the beat? How do you view the communities that you serve? And that's the problem. That is what sets us back, is that this isn't a one-off misstatement. It's part of an ideology that is incredibly harmful to communities, and particularly Black and Brown communities.
And at some point, somebody got in the man's ear, because I believe it was yesterday he issued an apology. And again, I'll read part of the quote from it. I showed a lapse in judgment yesterday during an interview. For that, I am sorry. I was in no way condoning the violence in DC yesterday. I ask that you consider the totality of my comments yesterday. What is almost totally overlooked is the fact that I said the president needs to accept responsibility for yesterday's events and that he should formally concede the race, end quote. What do you make of an apology like this?
Well, first and foremost, Maya Angelou famously said, when people show you who they are, believe him. This is a man who has been unapologetic about many of his statements in the past, and proudly so. And so I make of this is that he was not expecting the backlash that he got, not just from the general community, but also from those in law enforcement. And the apology doesn't take into account, we all know that Donald Trump should have conceded. He should have conceded back in November of 2020. That's not a hero's message to say that the president should have conceded. What I take of that is perhaps the realization that the public is tired of this backwards rhetoric, is tired of seeing those who have these privileged positions representing those in law enforcement have a complete and total disregard for the humanity of the people that they serve. And I should be clear, my issue is with the head of the FOP and what he condoned, not with the hardworking men and women who put their lives on the line.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a talking out both sides of the mouth, right? When you apologize for comments endorsing violence, it's almost like, and saying that what really matters is that I said he should concede the election. It's like, you're not actually sorry for what you said. You're sorry that people got offended by it. Jerry, I want to turn to you. You authored a piece on police reactions to the violence in the Capitol on Wednesday. Tell us a little bit more about how officers across the country have been responding to what we all saw on TV.
Well, we've heard a lot this week from a lot of different people, this quote sort of, "This is not who we are." And there's kind of been a resounding response, I guess, on Twitter and from critics saying, no, this kind of is what America is in a lot of ways. And I think what a lot of people are seeing this week is that this also is who police are in most ways and in a lot of historical ways. You've seen a lot of police chiefs, just for the sake of fairness and accuracy, come out and say that, this mob is lawless and shouldn't be condoned in any way. But at the same time, you have seen plenty of members of local law enforcement either voice their support for this online, share debunked conspiracy theories about the election, about voter fraud that aren't true, or in at least 3 cases that we've seen quite literally take part in the mob. There have been 3 either active or retired police officers who at this point, and we don't know if there will be more in the coming days, quite literally identified as having been in the mob that stormed the Capitol. And this might surprise a lot of people, but at the end of the day, this is actually, I think, pretty consistent with the history of what local law enforcement has been in this country, going back to, quite literally the invention of local law enforcement in America. From very close ties that local law enforcement had with the Ku Klux Klan very early on, all the way through now and today. We see over and over and over again, when there's a right-wing insurrection in this country or an act of right-wing terror, it's not all cops, but there almost always are some members of law enforcement that voice their approval for these sorts of things. And it almost never happens in the other way around. But when it comes to right-wing terror, there's almost always a sympathetic voice that comes from law enforcement.
Jerry, as State's Attorney Foxx alluded to earlier, a police officer is among those who were killed at the Capitol earlier this week. What do you sort of make of a crowd that is filled with people with Blue Lives Matter signs, ignoring, assaulting, and even killing police officers?
Well, I think we saw once again that the phrase Blue Lives Matter isn't a support for fair justice. The phrase is a support for essentially a white supremacist order in this country. And you see plenty of memes comparing Blue Lives Matter flags to, Confederate flags and Nazi flags and all those sorts of things. And they're often flown next to each other at protests nowadays. And frankly, that's what you see is when even, a quote unquote blue life gets in the way of that order, in this case, quite literally standing in the way of the mob storming the Capitol, it no longer matters. And I think what we learned and what a lot of people are seeing, I guess, throughout 2020 and through this week is that, that phrase is simply a dog whistle for sort of supporting and trying to go back to a white power order that has run this country for many years and is not actually a call for justice in America.
Thanks, Jerry. State's Attorney Foxx, I want to return to you. What effect do you think conservative media coverage of prosecutors, and especially Black and reform-oriented prosecutors like yourself, have had on the kinds of extremism that we're witnessing?
Oh, I think they play a key role. Those men who marched on and women who marched on my office on April 1st weren't there because they cared about what happened with, a B-list actor in his case. He had claimed that Donald Trump had done something. Donald Trump said something on Fox, and, conservative media, made me public enemy number one. And, they fuel this fire. I want to piggyback off of something that Jerry just said. There were 4 white nationalist groups that thought, that it was okay to go to a FOP rally, not okay, that they would be welcomed there. And that is the thing that I think is beyond disturbing. And, we know that they get their news from these alternative news outlets, these particularly right-wing conservative, ultra-conservative outlets. And, as people looked back at their presence at that rally in my office, they said that they thought it was a great recruiting event. And there should be something incredibly chilling that white nationalist, white supremacist organizations believe an FOP rally is a great recruitment event. We got a strong problem here related to that organization and white nationalism and white supremacy.
Thank you, State's Attorney Foxx. I know you've got to jump from us today, but we're very grateful for your time. I want to close and talk a little bit about what this week's events show about who and what police are for. It's something we've alluded to several times in this conversation with State's Attorney Foxx and with Jerry. But in this moment of national crisis, when we saw an insurrectionist mob storm the United States Capitol, law enforcement voices have seemed to encourage it. And this encouraged violence that led to several deaths, including one of their own. And this isn't especially new. As State's Attorney Foxx says, members of the same hate groups, pushed on by fear-mongering conservative media, have long been defenders of an entrenched social order that privileges hierarchy, violence, and whiteness. The purpose of policing is supposed to be, ostensibly, ensuring public safety. What's written on the side of the cars, right? Serve and protect. But at this point, the institution of policing is so far removed from protecting public safety that when faced with a direct, immediate threat to the entire legislative branch of the federal government, it was utterly incapable of responding. There was no plan to stop right-wing violence because right-wing violence is something cops don't stop. In some cases, officers seem to revel in it because they sympathize with the same groups perpetrating this violence. What we saw on Wednesday lays bare the central lie of policing in this country. The task of this institution is not to keep people safe, it's to keep people in their place. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining me on The Appeal Live. I'm Jay Willis. Have a good weekend.